Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Jim Birch. I'm an engineering manager at Canopy Studios, and I'm here with
Adam. My name is Adam Globus-Hoenich. If you don't know me, I go by Ben Approxima. I'm here at the Drupal channel, and I, like Jim, make only peanut butter breakfast.
so thanks for joining us, and away we go. We just wanted to preface this presentation that recipes are experimental. They were added to core in Drupal 10.3 under the experimental flag. They are rapidly changing. We are doing that in a non-destructive way. We are trying to maintain a little backwards compatibility, but there are config actions being added all the time. And as people create more recipes, that's what changes we're making. So if you do have feedback about recipes and what recipes should do and what you would want, reach out to us. We're on the recipe Slack. And I'm at the Jim Birch, and Adam is Meta Proxima. How many people here went to the excellent recipes presentation this morning? Okay, about a third of the room. So we'll go through this a little fast, but not terribly fast. But what is a recipe? It is a prepackaged bundle of configuration and content. It accelerates site building. Recipes are applied to Drupal. They are not installed. They're shareable as a composer package. They're predictable, they're declarative of what they are going to do to your site, and they're removable. I like to say that they're ephemeral. Once they're applied, poof, they're gone. So it looks like you did 20 hours of work in 15 minutes, which is great. Agency clients are going to love it. So what recipes do, there's 5 steps inside of the core code that we call them recipe runners. The first thing that a recipe runner does is apply other recipes. So right at the top of your recipe, you put any dependent recipes that you want. So it's great for composability. We want to make small recipes that we can build into larger packages. That helps with standardization, helps with the repeatability, and gives us a lot of the foundation that we can reuse over and over and share with the world. The next thing it does is install modules and themes. Then it can import configuration from various places, those modules, your content or your config folder in your recipe. It runs config actions, which is the magic of recipes, that you can alter existing configuration that you just imported from the module that you installed. And the final step is that it can import content entities. Adam, why don't you take this one?
Sure. So everything Jim just said, you could do with a module, but modules kind of suck at a lot of these things. Recipes were developed to do certain things, to do things that modules can't do so well. Among those things is building on top of each other. Recipes are very, very good at being composable. You can take a bunch of them, you can sort of fit them together, you can apply them on top of each other to make something bigger. They're like Legos. They're a lot better at bringing in configuration selectively, which is if you install a module, you kind of get all the configuration that it has. If you install an install profile, you just get everything in that install profile. Recipes can be a lot more choosy than that. They really, you're supposed to say, I just want this piece and this piece and this piece, this config for this module, this block from this theme, and they can be very choosy about that. Way easier than a module. Altering existing configuration is, as Jim said, a recipe superpower. Modules just suck at this. Modules suck at this because there's nowhere really for them to do it. They can, they can have hooks that run at certain times to change things, but that doesn't, that'll sort of work. Sometimes work when you want it to, and sometimes work when you don't want it to, depending on how well you understand how the system works. Recipes just, you tell it what's supposed to do, and it'll do it. Recipes can, as you said, import content. Modules can't do this without the help of the default content module. Recipes just have support for it. Boom. And recipes, if you want to, like if you install a module, say that relies on an API key, you'll install that module and then you have to go to some config form somewhere and enter the API. Recipe will ask for that. You can tell a recipe, I just want you to ask the person applying this recipe for an API key apply time when the recipe is applied. And so these are all the things that they're really, really good at compared to modules. But that said, in the next slide, there are things also that recipes are not so good at, or what they're really not meant to do, which is first and foremost, they're not code. They can't make decisions. There's no such thing as an if statement in a recipe. They contain no PHP at all. They don't run. They're applied once and then they kind of Drupal doesn't even know they happened. A recipe cannot contain other recipes the way modules can contain other modules. Every recipe has to be its own distinct little thing. If you want to ship a bunch of recipes at once, you would create what a particular kind of composer package called a meta package, which is just a composer package that has dependencies for the purpose of bringing in all those dependencies. Recipes also, because they are not something that sticks around, they don't have an update path. Modules do stick around. When you install them, they stay there. They're running all the time, and they have database updates sometimes, and sometimes they have big updates. Recipes do not have any of that. Recipes also cannot delete anything or uninstall anything. And there's reasons for that I don't have to go into right now because we don't have, all the time in the world. But suffice it to say, recipes are meant to be additive. They're supposed to build on top of each other and they're never meant to be undoing things that another recipe did. So, Jim, you want to take the next one?
No, this is your slide. Demo time. We really worked on this. Before we go into the demo, I'm going to share these slides in the recipe channel of the Drupal Slack to force you all to join us. And it has links to all the places you can find recipes. One of the issues that we have open, and I think it was discussed yesterday by some really smart folks here, are how to find recipes. Right now, we have recipe examples in Drupal core. We made the standard profile into recipes as our first proof of concept. Drupal CMS is the next place where we're rapidly working on more and more recipes. There is a recipes cookbook, which is like a wiki documentation page on Drupal.org that anybody can add their recipes to. And then there's some nerdy ways. There's the Drupal recipe topic or tag on GitHub where you can see people's recipes. You can use the Packagist Composer API to look for all composer packages called Drupal-recipe. But really, our issue is how are people going to find recipes on Drupal.org, like the module page, and in Project Browser? And we're a bunch of developers working on this code. We would really love input from like UX and content strategy and creative types and other people that aren't at it. So with that said, I'm going to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. I hit the escape key and the Zoom window came back. Oh, we were talking about how to do that. Really. So there we go.
Here. So, the slides. So I wanted to show you an example of a recipe that does basically all the things. Let's look at Drupal CMS. That's what I'm working on full time right now anyway. So Drupal CMS has a bunch of recipes, and I'll sort of show you that. There's most parts. So the main recipe, the kind of one that sets up the site for you, is called the starter recipe. That's the starting name for it. The starter recipe does a lot of things. Among the things, this is its recipe.yaml file, which is the only required file in any given recipe. You all have to have recipe.yaml. And it sort of outlines what the recipe will do. So to begin with, the starter applies a lot of other recipes. Some of these come from core. Some of these are just other parts of Drupal CMS. One of them is a third-party recipe that we liked for email setup. So that's the first thing. And then after that, it goes and installs a bunch of modules. of its own, and you just list them by their name very simply. And you can also install themes here, which is why we're going to be in Olivera. You just list them all in this one big install list. And then it starts doing things with config. So the first thing that happens is any config, I hope people can see this. The recipe can include a config folder, and in there are just regular exported config files of various kinds. So all of this is going to be imported. And so that's the first thing that'll happen. How the recipe system will treat conflicts with existing config is something we'll get into in a little bit. But there's a way to resolve those conflicts. But then the recipe says, this is what I want to import from various modules. So, I'm enabling the trash module earlier up, and I just want to bring in all of its config. Just import everything from the trash module. I'm also installing Lingot, and I want its image style. So it's doing that thing I said before, where it's really cherry picking the config that it wants from various places. Let's go back. Then let's get into the actions. So the config actions, basically, it's just saying, okay, I want to take a look at form.entity to the user entity form display, right? This is the name of the config entity that loads this. And then I want to do certain things to it. So what config actions there are kind of vary by what the config you're actually dealing with is. There's a list of all of them, and they're documented in this data set. We're adding more all the time. But one of the things you can do with a form display, or a view display for that matter, is the type component. This just makes sure that the path looks for the user profile is visible because who needs it. So that's an example of a config action that's happening here. We can also do config actions on what's called simple config, which is basically just it's like one-off settings. Package manager has one-off settings. So we want to change them a little bit. We do this simple config update action on that. Same thing with project browser. We change some of its settings to be like, oh, I only want to see these recipes in project browser. More of that, more of that, more of that. We're granting some permissions to the content editor role, which we know exists. And then there's a bunch of different actions to grant permissions kind of dynamically. But that's what we want to do. That's what we're doing here. Doing some other stuff. So this is sort of the basic idea of config actions. And then finally, what's going to happen after all this is anything in this content directory. We have a few things. We have some menu links. We have one node exactly. We have some shortcuts. These are all going to just be imported. Very similarly to what the default content module does. And in fact, all of these files are created by using the default content module. It's more the import part of that module is moving forward to support the recipe system. So we'll explain that a little bit more later, but that's the sort of anatomy of a recipe that is quite maximalist and does a lot. Jim, what's the next slide say? I feel like it's also mine, right?
Your guess is as good as mine. Let's see here. Yeah, how to apply a recipe.
Okay, well, all right, so live demo, just usual disclaimers apply. That worked for me 20 minutes ago. It'll probably fail now just to fuck with me. But anyway, so the normal way to apply a recipe is at the command line. I'm going to show you how to do it in project browser just because that's sexier, and it does work in kind of a very limited fashion right now. So what we're looking at here is Drupal CMS as it currently exists. It's still very rough, still working on it. So, bear that in mind. It looks a lot like standard, except it has this one AI written blog post. So if we go to project browser, which is installed by Drupal CMS, and we wait for it to validate some stuff, we wait no. And you can see that I am listing certain add-on recipes that ship with Drupal CMS, but are not actually applied by the starter recipe. So these are things you can additionally get. So ignoring the very weird view being the button here, let's add events and let's add SEO tools and install them. And let's see if this is fast. It should be. I would like to think it's fast. Might be slow. Might also have bumper. But what I would expect to see after this, someone tells me this, bro. Oh, no, it didn't. It works. Just took a while. So yeah, these are now there. So let's go see what I have now. If I go to, I want to go make some content. I have an event now as a new content type, and location, which also comes with events. And it has a bunch of fields, and it has an Ajax error, which is all very cool. But yeah, it has a field. I didn't have to configure any of this. I have to set up the modules for it. It just works. And it also has some SEO stuff because I applied the SEO tool recipe, and that went and changed what was already there. It, the event recipe came out, created its content types, and now the SEO one also then applied and then did some stuff to the existing content types, created these SEO fields, which honestly I have not used this, so I don't know what any of this stuff is. But the point being that here it is, and one of the things I know that SEO tool does, a thing is it installs the redirect, which is not part of the core, but SEO tool installs redirect. And look at that, we have redirect now. So that's all, it just saved me a bunch of work in about 20 seconds. It did something that would take me an hour if I was clicking through the UI. And that's kind of the point of the recipe, is to just do things that I could do in the UI, but do it a lot faster. And that's kind of it. So there's my demo, my the other demo. Jim, back to you, man.
Yeah, so what took a really long time to add them, took Martin and myself maybe, 3 or 4 days to build all those things to make into recipes. So yeah, we'll try to get it down to like 10 seconds, and then Adam will be satisfied. Okay, so we got this, and I go back to.
You can share again so I can see one.
Oh yeah, okay, and then we're gonna share again. Desktop. Hey, look at that. All right.
Oh yeah, I did say you could do it at the command line, and that was the command line doing this skip over. We'd all rather be project browser, but there's a command line for us.
Yeah, so there's this cool secret Drupal script inside of core, which is at core/scripts/Drupal, where there's the recipe command. There are probably some other commands, but we don't care about them. You can also use, if you're on Drush 13, there is Drush recipe, which is basically just a wrapper around this PHP command. So don't complain to them, complain to us if something doesn't work. Which was. All right, so let's talk about that lobster pot in Provincetown. The Pinot is amazing. Okay, and then where was this? Hide heating controls. All right, cool. Okay, so this is the basic structure of the recipe. Adam already said that the only thing required is the recipe.yaml. The recipe's name comes from the folder that it's in, and that's why one of the reasons why recipes can only be in one location. There isn't any validation like in a module, like there isn't another module called metatag, but you can't have two of the same folders in computers at all that are named the same. So there you go, instant validation. So people could make different CMS starter recipes, but Composer would help have a conflict. I don't know what would happen. But yeah, there's the config folder we showed you. There's the content folder, and the content folder gets the subfolders of the entity type. When you do export content entities, they are saved as a UUID, but I don't know if you noticed in Drupal CMS, they have descriptive names. So you can actually change the name of the content entity so you can have some organization, better developer experience. For distributability, you can have composer.json, and you want to have your module dependencies like you would in your site's composer.json, requiring any contrib modules that you're bringing in. And then the rest are nice to haves. We've taken project browsers guidelines for logos and made that our specification also. So the same logo file that you would want to put in your module to appear in project browser, you want to do in a recipe, a README and a license for being good developer people. In your composer.json, the composer package type must be Drupal-recipe. We have worked with the composer folks, and that is defined in their world. And you can do things like bring in any kind of dependencies, not just modules. So you could bring in NPM packages, third-party libraries, whatever else that you can get using composer packages or NPM packages. We talked about Drupal.org. Their guidelines for now are to create general projects. There are module projects, theme projects, different types of projects on Drupal.org. If you make a general project and then your composer file is set to Drupal-recipe, they've already configured it so packages are available on Drupal/whatever. So you can right now require a Drupal/events, and that's Martin's recipe already. There's just no way to find them without looking at the packages API. You need to configure your projects for recipes. So in Drupal core, there is a project template, the composer project template that you can follow. But basically, you just have to set up the installers. So we recommend that recipes are kept above the web root, similar to your config folder, usually. So it's above web, above doc root. Because recipes don't need to be a part of Drupal. They're only applied to Drupal.
Is that just for Drupal 10, or do you have to do that for Drupal 11 as well?
Well, if you start your project right now, it's already in it. But I'm assuming that there's some Drupal sites that are out in the world already.
Hi, Mike, and yeah, I think people have been in the web root for some reason, and people have been go about the web root. I know about the web root.
I'll have a question later on. I'll reserve my question for that.
Okay. He'll reserve his question for later. Okay. We went over the recipe structure already in our demo. We just wanted to have a slide here. Things to call out is that when you are applying recipes, the recipe name goes in there. If you are applying core's recipe, this is the special case of having a different location where your recipes. So that's like hard-coded secret sauce, and that's core recipes, and then the recipe name.
I think I can explain why we made that special section for core, but it's just for core.
Yeah, core special. Okay. Here's some best practices for config import that we've seen people do, and we don't want them to do it. But don't copy a configuration file from a module into your config folder and make a small change. You should import the configuration file from the module and then use config actions to change it. That helps with idempotency, which we talked about in the session this morning. But idempotency is the computer science term where if you do the same exact equation against a system, it should come out the same every single time. So we hope for recipes to be idempotent because they're safer to use, and we won't fork a site, hopefully. So there's a lot of effort into not breaking people's sites with recipes. Import only what you need. That's the selection of configuration files, and helps recipes be leaner and it'd be safer again. recipes don't know anything about optional. So in modules, your config folder can have install, optional, override, required, I think is one that core uses. Optional config for modules get installed if you have that module. But again, with recipes, there is no if. So if you want to install all of the config from this module, you have to make sure you require that too, or be selected if not. And then simple configuration files are always important. You don't need to define anything like that in your recipe. So the difference between simple config files and configuration entities is the number of dots, as I like to put it. So metatag.settings is a simple config file. That is always going to get imported because the module needs it. But metatag.default.homepage or front, that's a configuration end, and metatag doesn't need that to work. So it's up to you to decide to. So, well, thing I learned while working on recipes. All right, this is a fun one. You want to talk about strict, Adam?
Yes, I do. Because for the longest time, this was a real pain in the ass. What happened was, say you have a recipe that has a MVP, right? And it has it in the config folder. So if you don't have that entity view display already in your site somewhere, the recipe applies, no problem. That entity view display comes in, becomes part of your site, all good. Then you go make some changes to it, but then you reapply the recipe, and oh no, you get a big error that says, there's a big difference. There's a difference between what's in active config, aka what's in your site, and what the recipe has, and that was a major problem. This is now relaxed, or there's a way I could say to get around this, which is in a lot of situations, in probably most situations, keeping with the example of an entity display, the recipe doesn't really care. Or like a better example I like them even more is permissions, right? It's like if your recipe wants to add permissions to a role, it doesn't care what permissions the role already has. It just needs the role to exist, and then it's going to add permissions to it. So strict is a flag we introduced where you can basically say, hey, recipe, for any config that's in my config directory, if it already exists in the site, don't worry about it. Just leave it alone. Leave it as is. I'll mess around with it with config actions. That's what strict false means. That's not the default thing. The default thing is actually to keep the old behavior of the recipe freaking out if it sees any difference at all. Strict true. If you don't tell the recipe to not be strict, it's going to be strict. But you can also, there's a middle ground where you can be like, okay, recipe, listen, I don't care about most of the config in my config directory. I don't care if it already exists. Respect what's already there. But certain things I really do not want the site to have changed. And there you can actually say, just for these configs, I want you to treat just these ones very strictly. The case for this is, the only real case I found for this so far, to be honest, is field storages, because those influence the layout of the database. And if you have, say, a completely different kind of field with the same name as something in a recipe, then you don't want to be, that one leads directly to madness. So you want field storage to be strict. Most other things, not so much, but it's still good to explicitly say, I want to be lenient, rather than assume it's going to be lenient and be surprised later. So that's what strict is. It just solves a long-standing problem. And what you'll find if you look at the core recipe, the recipes in core, or even the recipes in Google CMS, I think most of them are actually now strict false. But this is a very, very useful thing for recipe authoring. And you should let the config be treated leniently if you're going to change it in some way, and you kind of don't care what it looks like if it already happens to exist in the target site. End of rant.
This is in 10.4 and above.
Yes.
There's a lot of fun things coming in 10.4. One thing that's in 10.3 is recipes can ask you for input. So Adam mentioned asking for an API key. which is a terrible, terrible practice because you should keep your API key out of the database. But another good example is email addresses. So Adam rewrote the core contact form recipe to ask for what email it should be sent to. So that's a great use case. You can do things like present a user with a list. So I imagine this is going to be expanded in the future to say, like, what content type do you want to add translation to? Or add, but yeah, the basis of this is in contact form is, as far as I know, the only example of it in existence. There's no support in the UI yet, so this is just a command line tool. But emphasis on the yet. And yeah, right now it can't be used for the thing that I was describing that I'm going to disagree with.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing. This is something we're talking about, but yeah, long story short, you can't use it to say, oh, I want to have this recipe applying this content. Here's the content, right? That doesn't work. It may or may not happen, but for me and Alex is what we're talking about.
So with config actions, for years I made custom modules that had a config folder, and you could just install it, and you could not install it, but I could basically import the configuration I wanted. But I could never touch existing configuration. So to me, that was the magic of config actions the first time. But another cool thing you could do, and it's starting to appear in the wild, like contrib modules can create config actions. Your custom module can create a config action. And that config action is immediately available for your recipe to use. So, you're installing the module in the second step of the recipe runner, and then in the config action step, you can actually use that config action that you made. So yeah, we have a huge list now. I'd say that there's well over 24. The Search API module just started adding their own config actions, so I hope they set precedent in the contrib community for other config modules to add their own config actions and then let me know so I can document it. That would be nice. Yeah. And then default content, we talked about this a little bit. Right now, Drupal core only has the ability to consume default content, but we do have on our long-term roadmap to kind of work and grab the rest of that module. Right now, that module gives you drush commands to export. So it's drush, DCER, the entity type, and then the ID of that entity. And then it'll export it into what folder you specify. You can change the name for better readability, but don't change what's in the YAML file because that's pretty complicated structure stuff. We don't recommend using this for deploying content. It's, to me, working at an agency, it's awesome for QA content. So like now I can build everything out on my local and create a small recipe and do it on my multi-dev QA environment and apply the recipe, and I have all my QA work. I don't have to rebuild things. It's great for demos and taxonomy terms, but you don't know what node ID is going to be on the site you apply the recipe. Recipes can be applied at any time to any site multiple times. What happens with content then? You get twice the content. So yeah. There's more creative, safer deployment, but default content in recipes is pretty awesome. Another use case, I just built out a huge mega menu for a site that I'm migrating, and this is looking like an 8-month migration, but they want to see the main menu just mocked up, so I can wipe out the database every time we do the migration and then just reapply the recipe as the main menu. Lots of useful, cool tools for that. Okay, anti-patterns. This sounds like a slide for Adam.
very simple. These are things that I've seen people do, and like I understand why they're done because the system is incomplete. There's not a config action for everything yet. But as I mentioned a couple slides ago, it used to be necessary to kind of use the create if not exists config action to create basically all your config if you didn't want it to potentially conflict with what was already in the site. The advent of strict false means you don't need to use create if not exists to create all your config. So don't do it. It makes the recipe diagram harder to read, makes it harder to maintain. Just use strict false, put stuff in the config directory. There's also some cases where when in config actions, people will be modifying config and they'll use the simple config update action to make changes to that config. This is a thing that looks like it works, but it kind of doesn't. And the reason is technical, but it can have unexpected, it can sort of fail to do things the way that you expect, is the long story short. So if there's a config action that will work, that will do the thing you want, use that. Always use the config action that actually is meant to do the thing that you want. Simple config update to change config entities is a thing that can bite you. So I strongly don't recommend it. People have asked about using recipes to do like config updates and for to set content deployments. Listen, you do that, you avoid your warranty. All right? It's just on territory. Work recipe for warranty voiding, don't have any one. Otherwise, yeah.
All right, so let's talk about creating recipes and some tips here. I work on 2 different environments locally. So the first environment, I start with the most minimal, the most minimal Drupal site I can. You start with a very simple recipe where you can start with the minimal profile. So I don't have accidental dependencies. I do like to install the Gin admin theme, but I know that I don't have a dependency or anything on it. And then have a second installation of Drupal that you can apply the recipe and wipe out at any time. So that could be like a fully built out site that has a config folder filled with how you like it, or just another minimal site. But like I do drush site install and config import if I do have config, and then apply the recipe again. So you can blow that away multiple times as you work on your recipe. When you do export configuration from your first site, remove the UUID and the _core UUIDs from the config. Those actually tie it to the site that you're working on, the Drupal installation, and make a unique configuration, which we don't want. We want configuration that's going to be the same on the site that you're installing. To extend core recipes when possible. The standard profiles media entities are a great one. Why do you need to make your own media entities? Use core media entities. And then you can make changes to it for yourself. One of our principles from the very beginning was to put reusable configuration in their own recipe for greater shareability and use, reuse. This does come with a developer burden to maintain lots of different packages. So yeah, Adam's figured out the git subtree split magic voodoo. So finding a fine line of having small chunks of a recipe is good. So like what a lot of us do is make a content type field base where we have all the field storages, and then put the field instances in the node recipe or another recipe, and then include only what you need. Testing. We talked about testing for item potency, and a simple human, I don't know, PHP unit kind of test is to just apply the recipe twice. That's how you know it's item potent. We do have an example in Drupal CMS of a PHP unit test that does apply the recipe twice. So there is a functional example, or an example of a functional recipe there. Also test that the recipe makes the changes you want. So we also introduced in Drupal CMS Cypress end-to-end testing. So Cypress is a great tool to test things in the UI, like your users would see them. And we do have it on our roadmap to set up a suite of GitLab tests for recipe creators, but it is an idea that has been written down, but I don't think anybody has looked at that. Oh yeah, Cypress, lots for mac and cheese. All right, what's next? Well, tomorrow I'm going to go clamming. But today, we need to talk about unpacking recipes. Once recipes are applied, Drupal knows everything about the modules that you wanted to install, but your website's composer file doesn't. So somebody made a composer package, a composer add-on package? Composer plugin that you can run that takes the dependencies from your recipes composer.json and moves them to your site's composer.json. We have issues in progress right now that are getting close to add that into the recipes core code. So you wouldn't need the additional plugin, which is pretty cool. And the idea is that the recipe would apply and possibly do that all in one step, or maybe there's a flag that you can add that does it too. So that'd be really cool user experience. We want to move default content export into core. Again, I think this is going to be a long-term project. The default content module has like 1,400 maintainers, and I think only Birch works on it at all. I don't know if that's how you say his name, but yeah. So that's going to be a while on this one. We want to add and improve config actions, and as you all start to make more recipes and module maintainers make more config actions, that system will continue to grow. Talked about this a little this morning. One of the APIs that recipes got added to core was the config checkpoint API. So right now it's only used for when your recipe hits a validation concern, it undoes itself back to that check. But it would be cool to expand that checkpoint to, say, revert a recipe. So I applied this recipe from Project Browser. It, talked a good game, but no, it just wasn't good. So I want to just immediately undo that. I can do that now by taking a config snapshot of my site, but I am going to definitely forget to do that sometime. So having that in the core would be cool too. And then making recipes discoverable in Project Browser and Drupal.org is what we talked about and we continue to work on. And that is probably our biggest short-term problem, concern that we should get done before Drupal CMS comes out. And I think that's it. Yeah, the recipes channel in the Drupal Slack is where we stock. We have twice monthly asynchronous meetings in that channel where we post priorities. People can ask questions. A lot of people ask questions all the time and being at them. We're like, here's how to do it. And then a link to our phase 2 roadmap. So once we finished phase 1 and got recipes into 10.3, we prioritized our issues in a big kind of meta issue. we still have the distributions and recipes project page. So our project on Drupal.org is a complete fork of Drupal. So right now, a lot of issues are just on Drupal core, but we maintain the project page fork also, so we can work on bigger issues, maybe things that will take multiple issues, like unpacking. We have an issue that we're going to unpack the recipe first. We also have an issue that we have to unpack patches that were on the composer also. So like we'll probably make multiple issues, multiple commits again, and then have one larger commit against Drupal core once that suite is ready. And then we do maintain documentation on a branch in that repository. So it's kind of hard to find, but the project page links to it, and I'll work on getting that someplace nicer soon. I made some commits today to it, added some new fun things. All right, so ask us all your questions.
So I actually can't stick around for questions because I'm in a library in Canada that's going to close in like 10 minutes. I'm on Slack. I'm on Slack more than is smart or healthy. So please find me, ask me whatever questions. I'm always happy.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and I'll answer your question grumpily. Like, I don't know. All right. Anybody have any questions? You want to?
Do you have an estimation on timeline when recipes might be production ready?
Because recipes are applied to Drupal, I would say you could use them now.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, it was the same with the patch when we had the patch. It was all like additive code into Drupal.core. But yeah, I mean, you do it on your local, it's the same as you clipping stuff together.
So back to pulling content in and not necessarily wanting to use recipes for content. I did a recipe to build feeds and then use feed support. Does it make sense as a way to pull content in, like to use the recipe to build your feed importer with Tamper and all the things, and then you don't run into content, multiple copies of content because you've run that multiple times?
Yeah, that sounds like, yeah, that sounds
to
awesome.
deal with content, just make the recipe to build the importer and then pull your content in.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't know. Does that sound dangerous though? Does that scare you?
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
not at all. Yeah, I mean, because you could build a feeds, importer yourself in the UI. So yeah, that's great.
I haven't built a recipe yet, so forgive me if this is like a super newbie question, but you all were very clear that there's no conditionals built into recipes. They're meant to just run and do what they're going to do. But then there's also this idea of config actions and even like custom config actions. If you need to have some kind of a conditional that is just limited to whatever might be found on a particular piece of configuration, is it legitimate to build a little bit of logic into a custom configuration action in a module that you import at the early stage of the recipe?
Does that scare you?
Yes, yes, that does scare me because I don't know what you're talking about. I would want a real world example, I think.
I'm gonna have to go back and actually build.
Yeah.
Is this stupid?
Yeah. So so my use case
Definitely
is
send that to Adam.
yeah. So here's my use case that I want to build someday is I want to install translation on the site, multilingual, and I want to say what languages do you want. So that's a conditional that we don't know. I could give it a select list, but there's certain dangers in changing config files. So like right now I can take an input, but I can't create a config file from it. That's where they drew the line, because I could misspell something, or I could, put in weird characters, or I could make a config file that already exists, or there is some inherent danger there. But yeah, I mean, making your own config actions, you can do nefarious things if you so choose to.
If you have a website and somebody has run 3 recipes and now that website is in a state that's going to exhibit bad behavior, do you have any way to find out what recipes have been run?
No.
You
No.
don't? You do not?
I do not. This gentleman,
We kind of do.
this gentleman does next to you. If the recipes are applied with Project Browser, you save them.
Yeah, we know which ones have been applied, period.
But like,
Not when and not how many times or anything like that. If you did it through Project Browser, we keep that.
and you keep it by saying, I can't install it again, apply it again?
Yeah, we actually don't let you, I don't know why, I'm sure Adam, technical reasons at this point. And it's probably a future enhancement, but we currently in the UI, we're not letting you apply it a second time through the UI.
Yeah, which is a bug.
So no
Yes, I see that
recipe,
being
so no recipe checksum that we could just refer back to and unpack?
correct. My hope, ultimately, we have a lot of collaboration to do, is I would love to just let the UI reapply, because they're idempotent, they should be able to do it. You should actually just be keeping a log of the timestamp, but when you, that would be surface to the user.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, so the reapplication of the recipe is actually like my recipe in Drupal CMS, where it adds fields to the content types that exist at the time of the recipe being applied. So if, in the demo, Adam applied the event recipe and the SEO recipe, and it worked at the same time. But now I want to add the blog recipe, and how do I get the SEO fields onto there? I would need to reapply the fields.
Just literally answered my question with the exact example of that.
Wow. So yeah, that's
Killing it over here.
yeah, that's why the item potency is important. I mean, like when you're doing these big, massive starter recipes, it doesn't matter. Like every agency, has built their own. A lot of agencies have built their own. But when you want to have these real world examples of this recipe does this specific thing, you want to make sure cover all the use cases. Yeah, I want these fields to be applied at any time. I don't want to add them to, or I don't want to like duplicate them. So I need them to fail gracefully on content types that already have the fields. I do probably want to ask a question of, do I want to add it to this content type? But probably says I can't do that yet. Yeah. What question?
Yeah, and I guess kind of a preface to my question. This reminds me a lot of Ansible in the sense that like you jump in, you do what you want to do, you're out, and leave no trace. But sometimes not do you want to leave traces, but it's nice to know what happened. It sounds like there's no logging automatic, but the idea that you could log it. So if you wanted to be able to be like, did we do this? I don't know.
Well, technically there is a little logging with config checkpoints, but we don't necessarily know that it was a recipe, but the config chain. Right? So we have that snapshot that the config changed.
There is also literally a module called config log, which will log every change to config. You could turn that on early to get pretty granular. But I think
Right,
a
but that's
log
not
is-
just gonna let you know the recipe ran.
The application
like your
log.
fingerprints there, like, oh, well, this happened, that. It was probably this recipe because that's what this recipe does.
It's an actual recipe application.
Okay. Yeah, so I should get out of the next people's way. But yeah, thank you. Like Drupal Slack, if you're not in Drupal Slack, I'm on LinkedIn. If you want to ask questions, I obviously love talking about recipes.
Thank you. I don't know if I can leave this state without getting seafood.
I can write the code. I have like a map of Instagram food pictures of one that I want to go to. After I hit all the.
I guarantee the residents of unhappy to.
Thank you.
We're just doing bets on whether Jim knows.
I think Jim does now, because he was in the issue.
All right, Jim, so I'll just ask Adam. Well, as well. It's making me crazy today.
Hi. Oh, yeah.
I have an 1107 site where I do not have the mapping in Composer installers in my Composer.json files. Yet when I do Composer require canopy image magic configuration,
Best recipe ever.
it ends up in the recipes page
Yeah,
on my
that's always a
project
handful
group.
of people.
And I don't know how. I can't find out.
I did a pull request on Composer something. Composer installers. I did.
Yeah, but it's in the next minor release. It's not in there right now.
It's not in there yet?
Yeah.
I don't know. You got a haunted Drupal site.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
So they're more
Sorry for.
users that.
Yeah, hogging up the room, I
Yeah.
tell ya.
But it helps
But, you know, there's clapping, people seem happy.
Yeah. There's some waters there for you.
Where do I plug in it?
There's a HDMI.
Alright, I got an adapter.
Okay.
Adapters might be better.
And don't forget to hit the red button.
Yep, I'll hit the red button and it'll turn red around.
Yes.
That looks like it's all set up.
Because in a,
It's still recording.
staffing.
Just recording. So, let's see about connecting. These are adapters?
Yes. Yep.
PC to HDMI. See how this works. So last year I brought a Linux machine and I ran into the issue of I couldn't mirror. I wasn't allowed to mirror.
Oh, really?
And so then as I'm typing, I couldn't see from
Oh,
the game
what a
mode.
nightmare.
It became a, so this year I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm doing a slideshow. I'm not going to type code.
Okay, you should be popping up there now. Okay, you're up there. So you know to push the red button, right?
Push the red button. I got that.
All right.
I'll make sure.
Remind us to push the red button.
Oh. It's not mirrored. Let's see. Just bring this over.
I mean, this is great already. We got Jean-Luc, right?
But I picked the picture of him from Love Boat: The Next Generation. I love that SNL episode. Alright. No anxiety on my part here. How do I go back? I must have clicked. There, go back. Anyone know from a mouse?
Right click? No. Can you scroll it?
Page view?
Yeah, okay, scroll works. Alright. I know my tools. Totally know how to use the slideshow. Alright, so.
Red button.
Thank you.
Good job.
So much trouble. Alright. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm excited to talk. This is my second NetCamp session I've spoken at. So not exactly the most experienced speaker here, but last year I did config sync where I went over kind of the basics, the stuff you would find online and quick tutorials, and you're like, all right, export, you get really excited, and then, then you run into problems. And so that's what this one's about. It's like, let's talk about the more advanced parts of it. So who am I? So I put this up here. So my son said, I was like, what do I do? And he's like, well, you make and code websites for money. You also help people with websites. I'm pretty sure, I don't know. That's my bio now. I'm very happy with that. He does think I'm from the dinosaur era, so when I told him I've been making websites for 20 years, and he's like, did you chisel on rocks? So he's a charmer. I worked at corporate database administrator, and they wanted to see the data. So websites was an easy, fun way to do that. And then I got into agency work where they cared about what the websites looked like. But I did get into Drupal around tail end of Drupal 7, and then Drupal 8 came out. And then I discovered config sync soon after that, and I was hooked. So I've been a big fan of config sync ever since then. And thank you for being here, guys. So I want to kind of know what room I'm talking with here. So show of hands, who uses config sync? Okay. And if you feel you're an expert at it. All right. All right, so you get to correct me if I do anything too stupid up here.
I am mostly here to get somebody else's strategies for config split stuff, so.
Okay, well, I do get to that at the very end, because it's sort of like config sync all comes on, config split.
I assume I know everything, because I raise my hand as an expert, but I actually want to hear another expert.
All right. And then, I have the room, aliens? No? No? All right.
I'm not telling you that.
So we're gonna. Hey, I had the platform. So we're gonna do a quick review. We're gonna keep it pretty quick. This is my philosophy, and you will hear me get a little preachy at times about config and different things. But config is code. I'm a big proponent of that. Your configuration is part of your code. Should be treated as part of your code. Sometimes you can spend weeks just finding that one checkbox that's very important that you didn't know existed. And then a little caveat here, don't put any authentication credentials in code. And that's for, you've got your, let's say you're connecting to authorize.net for payment gateway. And the UI gives you this beautiful field that says enter in all your authentication to it. I'm like, don't do that. There's other ways, don't do that. But I just want to put that down there as the second thing. So when I first got into config sync, it was all beautiful. You had the local development, you had the staging and the production, and you work on local, and you commit the config, and you push up the staging, and push it up to production, and then you bring the production database down to local development, and it's all refreshed. You're happy, and then then the real world hits. But that. In theory, that's your 30 minutes of YouTube looking at config sync. You get past that. So config flows up, content flows down, everything is great. Life happens. Real world problems are the worst. They have, there's requirements that break the wonderful diagram and make things not so elegant. So then you start scrambling of how to solve the problems with config. So that's what we're here to discuss today. We're just going to try to keep it, how do we do this the right way? I inherit a lot of sites over the years where I've seen other people's methods of config sync, and some of them make my eyes twitch, and I just want to help Drupal community not make my eyes twitch. So we're going to go, what can go wrong? So one of the things that comes up pretty often in this, I don't necessarily have a huge elegant solution for, but when config requires content, the water between code and content can get very muddy. For example, you're creating a view and you say, I have this view, but I need to limit the nodes to the taxonomy ID of 5. Well, taxonomy ID 5 is content. It's not config, but you're putting it in there. And same thing with new blocks. You're like, hey, I'm making a new block for the blog. I need this in the aside. But, you create that block on dev and you create it on production, you're getting different UUIDs. The configs won't work. They will yell at you when you try to import them. So that's one of the problems that happens. The other one is, you get everything going, your workflow's going great, and then you add clients. And clients don't work on dev, and so then they start going into production and modifying things. web forms or whatever they run into. I usually find web forms and blocks are the ones where they're usually modifying things. Then we have, this one starts getting really long, right? But when you're dealing with, you don't want the same config for every environment. Your local environment, you may want email reroute. You may want stage file proxy for your local development. And for staging, you may want reroute email in place. And one of the things I've seen for this is where people will just like, oh, I'll remember to turn it on. That's not, at some point, there's an angry phone call with the client. So we're going to be going a little bit over this. This is the sort of the end of the discussion. We'll be going over this with config split, but we want to show a way of having different configurations for your different environments. So this is the first one. This is one I said, like, it's muddy waters. I don't have amazing solutions for this, right? So we have an example of a view for filters to show only blog items of type business. The other one would be a custom block needed. So we were talking about that. There's really only two solutions that I've seen, and neither one is like amazing. So one is, this is the one I usually stick with. I need a new block, I need a taxonomy, I go to production, I make it. And I just pull that production database local, and then I create the config that I need, I create the view, I output the block, and I get the config from there. And then it comes to like, I need to deploy to staging, and I forget to refresh staging's database, and it blows up. But that is part of it. But that's the method I usually use. There is a module out there called Structure Sync, and there's even two ways to run it. And the idea is that you can specify that a menu or menus, blocks, or taxonomies can be configured, and you can push them up. You can push them up in different ways. You can say like, hey, wipe out what's there, replace it with this, or you can just say, just add, which even bugs me even more, because now you're talking about like, well, what's in the code doesn't match what's in the content now when you brought the content into config. So I avoid this, but there are situations where you may want to use that module. Every website and client and hosting, there's a lot of factors into what's going to happen. When production settings are modified, this is something I've seen many times where it's just like, well, client shouldn't have done that. Push ahead, right? And that could be because there's a bunch of scripts already in place. There's, you're inheriting something, and that's just the way it's been done, and that's not the biggest fish to fry yet, so you just continue forward with it. I do find it funny when that happens, but it's, that's what backups are for, and, you want to make sure you have good backups. Use the config read only. This one I have used, and it is one where the client went in one day and they tried to change a setting, and then they got very upset, like, hey, why can't I want to check this box and it won't let me? And it's like, well, because I put this on. And the client wasn't as bothered when we talked about, in that particular instance, it was to save them money. It's like the budget was one of the biggest constraints with them, and we needed to make sure that we had more control over certain things, and we weren't spending time, we were doing many deployments on a regular basis, and we needed to make sure we could handle that. There is a setting, this is something that, when I first started using this, I don't think it had this, where you can make sure the UI is the only one you can't edit.
Is that a module?
Yes.
Okay.
Config read only is a module. And basically, it's like if you enable it, you go in the back end, you try to do anything that would modify a config, it won't let you. So it locks down production so that production doesn't get modified.
I like that.
But this also goes into like, if you're going to have an announcement at the top of your website, don't make it a block. Make it a content type where there's a view with the block output that way your config doesn't change every time they make a new announcement, right? Or if you're doing a web form and you have content on there, try to make that a block that gets included so that they can modify the content of the block without modifying any config. But, yeah.
Is the idea that if you set that pattern early on out the gate, that come up with solutions as you go?
So yeah, config read only, you set that on production. You know, like local, you just make all the edits you want, and it allows you to have that diagram from earlier where it just only flows upward. There's no way for production to have anything change. But the reason why you make it for UI only is so that when you to deploy, your scripts need to be able to actually modify the configs. So originally I used to have to go in and manually disable the module, then import, then turn it back on. So that was the next feature. I do this on some websites. It depends on the client, right? But basically I go into production. I go to, you know, site settings, configuration. I go into what does config sync say? And I'll say, yeah, there's no changes. I'm like, oh, we can deploy. But if it tells me that there is a difference in the modifier form, a block, or you know, many other things that they might do, it'll let me know that. And in that case, normally it's, like if it's Pantheon, I just pull down the database local, I make sure I check out to the right Pantheon tag, and I do a config export, and I merge it in with what I'm doing. And it extends the deployment time. There can be issues with this, no matter how you do it, where you end up in a situation where the production's modified a config that you also modified locally, and there is no fun way to do that, but it's always solvable. You just, you know, always have backups. And sometimes I have gone into YAML files and manually, you know, merge them together, or I'll cheat and I'll just bring up the UI interface on production and I'll try to make the same setting changes in mine and not merge the code. We'll just make those edits on the branch I'm working on. I've seen this used multiple times, so I wanted to bring it up. There's a module called config ignore, and you basically say, like, there's a client where like they're always modifying XYZ content type, or they're always modifying this block or this web forms. And so they're like, we'll just do all the config sync except for web form. And this is one of those things that makes my eye twitch. I don't like this one. I say avoid if all possible, because config is code, and if you're ignoring config, then your code is incomplete in my mind. So will this exist? And I run into it. I don't like it, but I've seen it as like a Band-Aid where it was just like they didn't know what to do. So it was, let's just ignore this, and the client's just going to keep modifying that. We're just going to push all the rest of the config, and it still is a time saver for the developer. It's just, to me, the code at that point is incomplete. Let's see. Yeah, he is watching. Don't do that. Yes.
Can I just say one thing about config ignore? I found it's really useful for if you have modules that require you to put in API keys that are then going to be in config, so you're not putting API keys in your code base, which then potentially could get crawled somehow. You're exposing those, so ignoring like those fields and then putting them either in production or in the secrets files.
I've been fortunate in most of the situations. I use a .env.
Yeah.
And then I do config override, and there is a module that you can install that will then tell the user that that field has been overridden, what the overridden field is. So it doesn't end up in code. But yeah, I actually dealt with that first slide. Don't put authentication tokens in, and so config is code, and don't put authentication tokens in. There are weird ways around it. I recently dealt with Ansible. Different configs for different environments. So now we're getting to sort of the meat of where I'm going with like, hey, every Drupal site I work on, I want this sort of setup going. Like I've been evolving, I don't know if it's my laziness or what, but there's been ways where like I've been avoiding config split, and trying to get away with just .env variables, or for example, a .env, I can set this setting is this on this environment, this setting is this on this environment. But it doesn't handle things like enable this module. And I would always be like, well, if I need that module enabled, I'll just manually do it. But it's not good for certain circumstances. Don't just ignore things, manually enable them as needed. I'm guilty of doing that in the past. And email reroute is the classic one, right? It's on staging, and then you have a client with a lot of emails. You don't want to send out emails to their users unexpectedly. So I started off with .env extensively. I was doing that with a lot. There's another part to get, stored lots of credentials, and I think it was just I had a lot of sites that really the only difference that I needed between the environments was the credentials. So env really was a good fit in the beginning, and then as we got different Drupal sites, things did not always work out. And then we're going to get a little bit into the settings asterisk PHP and config split. All right, so let's talk that. I do use env still on most environments. If there's a Drupal UI config asking for authentication credentials, don't want those any of the YAML files. This is the module I was speaking of earlier. Config override warn will give a graphical representation to the UI to indicate if anything's been overridden. And so if you override things in settings.php or that is a really nice thing to see at the top of the page. For e-commerce, it would say, look at env would be the what I would set it to. And then at the top of the page, it would actually show you what was being used. Let's see. You can have settings and services file based on which environment is loading the site. And that is the huge power. You combine that with config split, and you end up with a really powerful environment locally on your staging, on production, and just, it took me a long time to get to that point. It took me a long time to wrap my head around all the different aspects of that. But once it clicked, it was very powerful. And it was much cleaner, much easier to copy to the next site once I understood it. It's just dependent upon your hosting environments and your local setups, but once you get it all set up for one, it's fairly copy pasta to something else. So yeah, it's, I might, you go to sites, default, and you have your settings.php, and I'll have sites where it's like, oh, I got settings.pantheon.php, settings.platform.sh, settings.local, and settings or services for each of them. And so services generally is just like my services.local, enable twig debug, so I get an easy, I don't have to do anything with that. Then the settings.php lets me do some other things. So, and we'll sprinkle in things. This is screen caps. I didn't want to demo things today, but I took some screen caps, and I think I hit client info on this. So, is an example of you install config split in Drupal, you get a backend interface to it, and you set up each of these, right? And this one, there's some migration going on, so there's more than 3. It's more than just, development local type thing. So, but in this case, I took a screen grab from my local environment, which was on Lando. So, you can see here where it's telling you, this is the active one. These are all inactive. So Drupal now knows that you're on a local environment. And the question is, well, how does it know that? What does it do now that it knows that? And that is the really cool thing. So config split really does let you say, like, you have your sort of config common, config all. Every Drupal environment you have has these configurations. An example would be your core.extensions. That should only have the modules that are on every environment you have. But then each one of these can have their own folder inside of your config sync folder. And you're able to, Drupal, and we'll get into how it knows this, but Drupal knows that I am on my local environment. And so now it's going to load the all config, and it's going to care about what's inside that subfolder. So when you click into that, it's basically saying, oh yeah, this is this. It's going to be stored in the folder config local. If you scroll down on the page, you would have seen this, and it's like, which modules are config split? It's like, well, stage file property is one of them. And so now, if you do a config export, it's going to export all your config changes to the config common, and for just those modules, that I selected in there is going to export those configs into this folder. So when I go to staging or production, they don't, and I do config import, it's going to ignore everything in there. So I can do whatever settings I want for stage file proxy. It's separate from the common config. All right, so this is 2 screen grabs. Up here, I basically just said, hey, show me all the things underneath config local. And so you can see we're circling back from config split to the settings. So I have my develop stage. So the idea is that, so this is local. So when I did the config export, these are the modules that it had settings like I had checkbox for. I was like, hey, the devel stuff, I'm not sure, devel toolbar, and then stage file proxy. Those are things that it exported right to this folder. And so only that environment cares about it. And when I come over to, I probably should have done a better job at this. ls config, I'm like, show me, so this is in config common. So this is the config for every environment. And we just saw it on the previous page where you had the different environments where it had, we had local, staging, production, and then just the main settings for it. So those config YAMLs relate to these. So if I go to production, I'm still going to see these 4. But in production, it's going to tell me that production here is active and the others are inactive. But the settings for all those are right there. And then I come over here and I said output the local one. So just that one local that's active, what's underneath it. And it shows me this. And one of the important things you should know here is devel and stage file proxy. So underneath the folder, it stores the settings for those that you would expect. When you modify settings on a page, you export, okay, you got the settings for the module you enabled. But the system.extensions.yaml, which is the YAML file that tells your system what modules are enabled on your site. That one should never be in a local, and it should always be in a common. And it should be only the modules that exist across every instance. But this beautiful little 2 lines there will tell it when it does a config import that on my local environment, I want stage file proxy enabled. So it enables the module, and then it imports the config from the, config/local. So we've kind of gone over everything except for how it knows which environment you're on. That's the big unknown, right? So you have your common config, you have your individual environment configs, which is little files in them for whatever you needed. You have this, which tells which modules. And let's see if we go to here. This, so if I go to sites, defaults, and I look at my settings.php on one of the sites, don't take this as gospel. This is not something I do on every site. It's written in different ways on different sites. This is just the one I inherited, and it works for today's purposes. But in this case, this site includes all the subsettings. So I have a settings on platform, tugboat, lando, local, and basically just looks through all of them. It says, include them all. We want all of them. But over each of them, and this is where your hosting is which hosting you have is important. First one is like lando info equals get environment that. Well, if that doesn't exist, then I'm not in lando, so just return, and we ignore the rest of it. And there'll be something like that for Pantheon, there's something like that for Tugboat, there's something like that for Platform Sage. So it's interesting to find what that is for each. Another thing I've seen for this is rather than include them all, if there's a .env already in use, I might just put a .env variable for which environment we're on and depends on the hosting bucket for that. And the same thing can work for, services. This is dealing with settings.php. We can also deal with services and make sure your local environment has a code debug going. And when you scroll down here, you see, so like, if it is a Lando site, so if I'm running local and it gets past that, well, then it's like, all right, well, here's the credentials, and it just goes through, and you can put whatever you want in it. But down at the bottom of this file, it has this config, split, local, status equals true. And that is an override. And that is why this says overridden. So each of those settings.php files, the production one sets this variable to be overridden to true. Staging overrides and says, well, this one should be true. And so that is the key piece to telling config split which environment you're on. There is a way in config split if you run the commands in certain ways where you tell it to config import and to target local or include local or not local. I don't like typing all that out because I'm afraid I'm going to type it wrong. I just want to do config import, config export on every instance and be happy with it. And that's where this setup comes into play. Once you end up in a situation where your Drupal site has a setting.php and a services.php for each environment, and you've got config split installed, it's just nice. It's like, on local environment, I got my devel, I've got my stage file proxy. I don't have to worry about it. On staging, I've got my email reroute, and there's no chance, as long as we're just doing config import, that I'm going to forget that I have email reroute not enabled. It will always be enabled on staging, always be disabled in production. Local has its own email handling thing, but this is the power when you start combining the different tools together of having this different configuration for every environment and a nice, easy way to start pulling things down. Refresh your local, you're not worried about making any changes to settings afterwards. And so normally I have a script just pulls things down, and that script looks very similar on staging and local development. Let's see. And this is, so if you might have noticed I'm not the best formatter of graphics for a slideshow, but if you would like the slideshow, this is the QR code for it. And I believe that is the last slide. I don't know if I talk quickly or I didn't put enough slides up, but we've got about 15 minutes for questions, but I figured this might be more of a question and answer type of meeting than we. Yes?
So to recap, you use a combination of config split and then config overrides, and you use config split if you're enabling or disabling a module, but then you prefer to use the config overrides to set, I guess, settings of the things you're changing, like for your local.
Yes-ish.
Okay.
I think what you're saying is right. Yeah. So it is. When we scroll up to this, and this line here is a config override. We're taking it, like, we could look for this file, and we could find that variable in it, and we could find that array variable, and we could you could see that in a YAML config file. You go to / in this particular instance, it would be /config /common for all of them. And it would find this one thing and change it. And that would be the config override. And once that's overridden, config split will change how config import and export works, because it now knows, well, this one particular thing is active. You're in the local environment. So whenever I do a config import or config export, I'm going to include I'm going to include the config /local.
So I was taking it one step further. So instead of just that, let's say for stage file proxy, if you had it enabled on all environments, you would just set the setting to set the path in the setting PHP, or do you like to do that in the other file. Like you could set it right there in settings.local.php to say like use.
You could, yes. So
do you like that, or do you like?
So settings.php will not enable a module.
Right.
You can override something.
That's to say if it's on all three.
And that's where the config split is required. Through just settings.php, if you wanted to put a bunch of setting overrides in everywhere, you could do that, but it won't enable the module automatically without the config split, doing config import and enabling that module. And that was sort of the piece that was was resistant to get to in the very end, was I was trying to avoid config split for the longest time. And then once I embraced it, I was like, life is better.
So do you like putting all the setting overrides in the PHP file, or do you like doing it in the, when you export config, so it goes in the config local directory?
I like it. I like to minimize the settings.php because once you start getting into, hey, I've got 4 different services files, 4 different settings.php files. The cleaner those are, the easier it is for the next developer to absorb it, or me a year later to absorb it. And then it's like I can always just look in the config local and be like, okay, I see what's going on there. So I want to keep the settings as clean as I can. So each thing I add in there should have a decision, a reason for it being added to it.
Okay, makes sense.
Just curious about the config read only and the config ignore. Why you didn't use the config read only? You did have the whitelist pattern. You can kind of put over there and can put the ignore configs like that. You want to open config in production and you can put over. What's the difference you will notice?
Difference between
the read only has a whitelist pattern, like the thing that you can ignore. Actually, the same thing.
Oh, whitelist pattern. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't.
Did you use that before? What's the difference you saw? What's the
I
benefit?
haven't really used the whitelist when it comes to config stuff. I've used config. I've seen worked with sites that had config ignore, but never like. I know there's drush commands of like config export, but don't do these, and then you can make that into a file. Like your composer could or something could add in a list of arrays. I haven't really dealt with a site that was dealing with that, but config ignore. I have used and I liked it, but it's hard to find a client that likes it. That would be usually my thing with that one is the clients are like, they're like, it's Friday, we just wanted to change this field on a form to say this or something along those lines, and then they find that they couldn't. And they're like, So in that case, that's why I've only succeeded at 1 or 2 instances where I got config and ignore installed, or config read only installed. And with the config read only, it was a conversation I needed to have with the client before I just did it. Because I needed to sell it to them of this will save you money because every time I deploy, it's a lot easier on me. But without that, if I didn't have that argument for it, I just took away their power, because normally with Drupal, I'm trying to empower the user to do all sorts of stuff, and to say, it's the weirdest thing. You're like, why can't I edit this page all of a sudden? Oh, it's a config. When you work with config sync, and you do your first config export, it's just thousands of files. It's because everything's a config in Drupal, and then to take all that power from the end user, it has to be the right fit for that one. But the config ignore, I want the config to be in my Git repo to be accurate.
So have you had an issue where config sync doesn't sync?
Yes.
Everywhere? So from production to stage to local even?
So config sync, so it's one of those things you're like, I got composer files, I got my config sync folder, I got all this stuff and all this my theme, and you're like, look at this code, isn't this code great? And then the weird part is that code will only work with a database from a certain point in time. And each time you roll out a new change to that, if your database is too far out of sync, it won't work. or the client might be using staging to test something out, right? You give them as a sandbox. If you're not sure, you're afraid of doing this edit on production, go to staging, do stuff there, and then they do that. And then it just blows up your config. Or a common one would be, you were doing something locally, you tried it out, and then later you're like, I'm just going to delete that field, I don't need that field, or I don't need that reference or something. And then you go to deploy it up, and you had tested it further up, and now it's like, I can't delete this config because there's content associated with it. And you're like, uh-oh, all right, where is it? I need to kill it. So that would be another thing I run into with the whole like, everything's working out great, and all of a sudden, kaboom, like, nope.
How do you resolve it though? So like, one of the things that is a very annoying bit from dealing with config for my purposes is line changes. So like, it could be on line 19, but on my file locally, it's on line 15. It's just shifted down on production, and I don't know why.
Are you on the same Drush version on all those environments?
How could you get out of sync?
I don't know. Maybe there's like, I run into a server where like the Drush, they set it up as like a global setting rather than like one that comes from your composer. But there are times when I'm doing config sync, and every time I run it, it says there's 6 things that need to happen. Say import, it says succeeded. I do it again, it says 6 things need importing and are needed. So in those cases, I'll do a config export, and usually you'll see it's just 2-line swap. And then I'll like, all right, export. Yeah. So then I usually export and commit that, and usually it works.
Question was, like I would call that a bug. There's a second bug I run into where I export config and it's like there's no changes. So I go wipe out a config file, then export again, and then it gets it.
I haven't run into that before.
Just where I'm working. Or?
But I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a key thing are annoying.
I've seen that problem happen if you're to use like DDEV or Lando.
Lando, yeah.
So if you've made the change and it hasn't had enough time to like sync the changes out of the virtual machine, that's where I've seen it happen. Like if I go right to my get status and it's like no files have changed. Like I totally exported the config. What's going on? But then if I wait like a minute and then do it again, then it shows them all.
Okay.
So SSH into Lando and try it then and see if it works.
Oh yeah, I don't SSH. Yeah, that's true.
I also saw that if your team had different local environment, like some developer use Lando, some developer use DDEV, then the config format kind of shifts a little bit between different, and then this one import Lando, this one import DDEV, and so that's why sometimes you saw. Yeah, we also saw that exported, imported again, we've solved the problem.
So I had a question. Go to your next slide. This is also how we manage down the bottom the config split, right? We turn them on like that in our settings based on environment variables. One of the issues that you can run into is if you have a config value that is shared, like you have a version of it for production and a version for it local, but you want to change the version that's for production, like because you're updating something, and you go to export it and it updates local. How do you remember to like, I got to switch over to the production version to update the production version of these configs? Do you go, because sometimes I'll forget, like I have to go and like turn on the production.
Oh, like you're talking about like I'm working, I'm just, all this conversation was talking about common and local, but then I need to go to staging and do the same thing. Like I need to change a setting on staging that's only for the staging thing. That might be one of those situations where if I really cared, and it depends on the environment. Some environments you can't SSH into staging or something. So for those, you can run config export, and you can give it parameters that lets it know like you want to export to your staging folder, even though you're on local, and you could do something like that to get those same configs. Or you could just cheat in some cases and copy pasta between one or the other. As long as you go to your get differences, you're like, oh, that looks right. But no, I would try. I haven't really run into that, but my first guess would be to go find those commands that let you, because if you don't have this set up, if you don't do it in the settings.php, you can still export only to this environment and only import from this environment. So you could still do all the staging and production specific things when you're doing it on dev. But yeah, that's gonna be one of those where you'll deploy it and you'll forget about it, and then they're like, didn't we just pay for this feature? And I'm like, oh, yeah.
It ended up in your
I need to go clear cache. Doesn't work if you give the client the whole clear cache button at the top.
I do what you do, just change the environment on the
Yeah.
to zip proc. Or I open the YAML files in the
Yeah,
folder,
usually
just
that's what
change
it is, like, oh, this
the
got
URL.
exported in the wrong split.
One of your first slides mentioned dot environment variables. Are you just talking about the environment variables that are already in the environment that you're using, or are you creating?
I created .env. So normally what I do is in the Git repo, if I have a site that uses .env, so it's like a composer, include whatever .env tool to get you to have that. And then in my Git repo, there'll be a .env.example where all the variables that I want set should be in there. And then I copy that to my .env. And that is in my git ignore, so it's never committed up, and that's the one where I put like my authentication stuff. So it is plain text, but it's never in git. And if you really, but that works great on some hosting environments, but not every hosting environment you're not going to get .env to. And that's where like other things come in, or maybe I think one was like Ansible, where you're trying to like use Ansible to encrypt authentication tokens inside your code so you can commit them, but you have to have like a super long key and part of your deployment script to decrypt the file once it reaches the final destination. And I'm still working to wrap my head around that, but I'm working on that. But most of the sites I work on that I need the .env for, it's like on a cPanel or something like that, so I can SSH in, I can just type out the .env. And once the environments are set up, it's great. But then you deal with like Tugboat, where like you go to platform SH and you say, I'm doing a pull request, and all of a sudden an entirely new mini site is spun up, and whole new URL, and you just gotta like have different workflows for that. But even on Tugboat, it does work because there is an environment variable like this you can find, so you can at least get your settings.php to know that you're on Tugboat. I'm still trying to wrap my head around Tugboat. I'm using it because I inherited the site with it, but I haven't like fully dug into that one yet.
It's decent enough. The only place I've seen it trip me up is where I have like custom solar stuff integrated. So like if I have views that are driven by solar, then Tugboat doesn't do particularly well for testing those.
On Pantheon Solar, I always have to go in and rebuild index.
Yeah. It's just that like it doesn't unless you depending on what your account with Tugboat is, you might not get an actual Solar search server with your environments to use. So
now I'm going to be shameless. I'm going to ask Alfred here to take my picture.
Oh yeah, sure.
You know, because like I don't present as often as Mike over there does. But okay, I'll get the rest of that part.
Aliens in there.
I just want to get back to the title page. Where is it? But see, Mike. So
sorry, I missed that.
And don't put authentication credentials in code. Config as code. That's my first pet peeve of like or philosophy things. But yeah. Aha.
Oh, make sure it's focused. All right, check them out and see if
Thank you. I should be fine.
I take tons of pictures. So I got your point.
Whoever told me to hit the red button, thank you. I know it came from over here.
Stuff getting
So I finished this presentation at 5:15 this morning, and then went to bed. I'm ready to go home.
Yeah. I'm a little worn out myself.
But I was happy. It was one of those things that, like, I set aside time this week, and then when the clients had those emergencies, it takes 12 hours.
That's made my life, that
like, well,
made my life miserable to the point where like
priorities.
The team I work on, we
every single config, you need to know what it is before you
Yeah.
install it.
Yeah, what really helped me on Visual Code on the left, where it had that little Git plugin, it showed you the things that changed, and I'm like, well, what changed?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I don't know what that is, let me revert and then do an import.
I think it went okay. I don't know, judge from the room, it went well? Okay. Okay.
But then I'll forget to import the local config, and then all of a sudden it's like delete.
It's a big relief to be done though.
I ended up to get around that, I ended up doing having
Those are all your tables. I had a mini panic attack last night. I couldn't get the thing to charge. I gotta buy a new charger. It got it to work eventually, but it took like 15 minutes.
So I have 2 Lando environments, and then so it brings like production changes that they make on the config, like production environment, then into a separate package. And then merge that because otherwise I've got clients screaming about changes to web.
And I know you reminded me, but someone up there remembered the button.
It's good, yep. The more the merrier.
And it was recorded.
Good.